The boy was shivering so hard he couldn't hold the kindling. His fingers wouldn't close around it, just scraped it around the dirt like he was trying to dig a hole with bare bone. She pulled him close and wrapped his hands inside the folds of her skirt, right beneath her own arms, and she didn't care anymore if he cried. Let him cry. Let the others laugh. Let them laugh all the way into the blizzard if they wanted, because she knew the sound of bones freezing. She had heard it once, years ago, during another storm, in another cabin, back when she still had a husband to keep the fire lit, back before she understood what cold really was, and she was not going to hear that sound again. That morning the cave had been just a hollow in the hill, damp, narrow, black-smelling, a thing animals crept into to die or give birth. But by sundown, it was home, and not because it had walls, not because it had a door, not even because she had dragged 2 children into it with frostbitten cheeks and stomachs empty from 4 days of broth made from birch bark and melted snow. It was home because she said it would be, because if she didn't call it that, then the thing they had left behind, the log cabin collapsing into itself under a drift so tall it buried the chimney, was the only other word she had, and ruin wasn't a place children could survive in. So they had moved into the earth itself. She hadn't told anyone at first, not the preacher who came by their cabin once a month asking if she needed scripture, not the neighbor's boy who'd taken to following her with that quiet, embarrassed pity men reserved for women who used to be beautiful, not the settler woman who offered her old skirts and sour milk and looked around her porch like it should have had a man's boots on it. None of them knew where she went after the last snow collapsed the roof, and she packed her 2 boys into an old sled and vanished down into the gulch. It was the boy with the lantern, Daniel Crane's boy, who first saw her again, days later, hauling bundles of greenwood up the rocks with raw hands. No hat, no scarf, just a face burned red by wind and firelight, and shoulders bent like something inside her was hollowed to make room for more work. He followed her a ways, then ran back laughing to the grown men. "She's living in a hole in the cliff," he said. "She made a house in a coyote den." They all laughed, for a time, until the freeze set in, the one they called the crawl, because it moved slow but didn't stop, the one that killed livestock in barns built thick with pine, that burst water buckets and left axes stuck in the middle of splitting logs because no one could grip the handle anymore, that freeze. And the cave stayed warm, they didn't know how. Not yet. But inside, past the first turn in the dark, down where the old fire coals lay in a circle of stone and soot, the cave had a draft, a little breath of warm air from deeper inside, some strange trick of heat and rock and buried steam. The first time she felt it, she nearly dropped the torch. The second time, she started building. The walls came first, lashed branches from the chokecherry grove, and a second layer of old roof planks she'd salvaged from the cabin's wreck. She sealed them with mud, not just any mud, but the thick clay kind that held even after it dried, made from the same ground that had swallowed her cabin's foundation. She mixed it with straw, hair, even dried moss when she could find it. She used her own breath to thaw the edge of every clump, shaping it with bare fingers. By the time she finished, her nails were black with dirt, and she couldn't straighten her hands without wincing. But the boys stopped shivering, and that was enough. They laughed when she lit the fire, said the smoke would choke them before the frost did. But she dug the trench herself, a tunnel from the front of the cave, up through the hill, vented with an old chimney pipe she'd dragged from the ruins, lined it with rock and sand and ash, let the heat rise slow. The smoke curled out clean, higher than the trees, like it belonged there, and no one saw it, because no one came to the hills during the storm, not at first. But then someone noticed. The preacher came again, bundled in 2 coats and a wool hat that looked too new to be his. He found her boys outside the cave, rolling a snowball down the slope like it wasn't 20 below. Their breath steamed in the air. Their cheeks were red, but not from frost, from heat. He followed the smoke and found her sitting just inside the doorway, feet bare, stitching a blanket by firelight. And when he asked her if she needed anything, food, supplies, prayer, she just pointed to the back wall of the cave, a pantry, stacked root vegetables, wrapped meat, clay pots sealed with wax and snow packed tight as a mountain cellar. "You'll die in here come spring," he said, and she didn't argue, because maybe she would. Maybe the thaw would flood the cave. Maybe the damp would rot the walls. Maybe the bear that once slept in this hole would remember the path home. But her children were warm, and she had already died once, in a way, the day her husband froze 2 miles from their cabin, trying to bring back medicine he never reached. She had buried him in snow that never melted. She had watched her oldest son try to split wood with arms too small. She had held her youngest through 3 nights of coughing so deep she thought the mountain itself was trying to claim him, and no one came, until now. Now, they came. Because as the storm worsened, as the wind took doors off hinges, and even the preacher's own roof collapsed under the white weight, they saw the cave firelight still glowing. And they started asking questions. She didn't answer them. She had no reason to. Let them laugh. Let them wonder how she'd done it. Let them pretend she didn't know something they didn't. Something that had nothing to do with stone or fire, and everything to do with grief. Because grief, she'd learned, is warmer than most men know. It makes you move faster, dig deeper, burn hotter. It makes you ignore what's proper, what's decent, what you're allowed to do as a woman alone in a frontier town that thinks pity is a form of charity. It makes you crawl into the belly of a mountain and build a home out of mud and prayer. And it makes you strong enough not to care when they come to your door with desperation in their eyes, begging to be let inside. Because when they came, when the first family arrived, teeth chattering and eyes wide, she stood between them and the warmth, not out of cruelty, but out of knowing, because she had learned that in the deepest parts of the earth, heat is not given freely, it is earned, and she needed to be sure they understood that. Before she opened the door, they stood there, the family, 5 of them huddled like sheep under a borrowed quilt, snow already crusting the sleeves of the father's coat. The children looked worse, one girl without shoes, her ankles wrapped in burlap, the boy holding a cracked lantern that had stopped working 2 valleys back. Their eyes didn't move from the faint golden line that spilled out from the cave's door seam, and still she waited. The widow had learned not to open too quickly. Kindness in these mountains often got mistaken for weakness, and weakness was something the cold devoured first. She saw the father shifting his weight, rubbing the child's arms too hard like he was trying to bring her back from the edge. She recognized that kind of panic. She had lived it. She knew it didn't help. "How long have you been walking?" she asked. The man blinked like he hadn't expected her to speak. "Since yesterday," he said. "We lost the trail. The horse broke its leg, buried it back near the ridge. We're not begging for much, just a place to thaw." "And then what?" she said. He didn't answer. Behind her, her boys watched in silence. The older one, Sam, had learned to hold his breath when he got nervous. The younger one, Thomas, clutched a stick like it was a sword. Neither of them had said a word since they heard the knock. She could feel their heat from behind, huddled just far enough from the fire to keep the shadows on their faces. She opened the door a little wider and let the heat touch the man's face. His eyes flicked up. Hope, maybe, or guilt. "You bring anything with you?" she asked. "Food? Wood?" The man shook his head. "We weren't planning to leave the house. But the roof, it didn't hold. I've got a wife here, and these are my children. You think I'd come this far to lie?" "I think people do what they have to when the cold starts peeling the skin off their fingers," she said. "I think that makes liars of good men." He looked away then, jaw tightening. The child beside him began to cry. She stepped back. "One night," she said, "and let them in. They didn't take their boots off. There was no time." She could see the frost on the girl's toes, already black at the tips. She stripped the child's feet bare and wrapped them in rags she had warmed by the fire. The mother, white-faced and silent, leaned against the inner wall like she hadn't sat in 2 days. The boy with the broken lantern just stood by the fire until his eyes went glassy, and she had to slap his cheek to bring him back. The father, he didn't sit, just kept glancing around the space like it couldn't be real, like he was waiting for it to disappear and turn back into the wind. "How's it this warm?" he asked. She didn't answer. "Don't smell like smoke. Don't feel like draft neither. You done something in here. This ain't just a cave." Still, she said nothing. He kept on talking, like silence was a wound he had to fill with words. "My pa used to say warmth's a lie. Said cold always wins in the end. Said the best you can do is slow it down. That what you done here? Just slowed it down?" She looked at her sons. Sam was handing the girl a tin cup of boiled bark broth. Thomas had retreated behind the stacked crates, watching the family like they were made of glass. "No," she said finally. "I didn't slow it down." She leaned closer to the fire, shifting the old kettle so it wouldn't boil over. "I beat it." That night she didn't sleep. She sat up near the fire with a hatchet across her knees, not because she feared the man would hurt her or her boys, but because she didn't trust desperation not to whisper strange things to a person in the dark. She'd heard stories of what the cold could do to a man's mind, heard about the homesteader who slit his own son's throat thinking it was a deer, about the woman who boiled bark until she believed it was stew and died with a smile on her face. The cold didn't just take your breath, it took your memory of what warmth was. It rewrote your logic. It made you forget fire had to be earned. In the morning, the man offered to help fetch more wood. She let him go. He came back with frost on his eyebrows and a look in his eye she didn't like. "Saw tracks?" he said. Others coming. From town. She said nothing. You tell people? No. Then they're following the smoke. She stood slowly, brushing ash from her skirt. I don't own the wind, she said. No, but they'll think you own this. The next two that came didn't knock. They stumbled in half-collapsed, dragging between them a sled with a burlap-covered bundle that turned out to be a dead dog and a broken axe. One of them was the blacksmith's apprentice. He used to sell nails to her husband. The other was a young woman with blisters on both lips and eyes that never quite focused on anything. Neither spoke much, just curled near the fire and whispered things to each other that made no sense. By the third day, there were 10 people inside. She moved the crates, cleared more floor, hung blankets from the ceiling to make pockets of privacy, used her husband's old coat to seal the cracks around the doorway. She built a small clay oven in the back corner with stones that had once lined their cabin hearth. Cooked slow, used the heat to help dry the mud walls. They all started asking how she did it, how the cave stayed warm when their cabins cracked from cold, how the frost didn't creep in, how the food didn't spoil, and she told them nothing, because the answer wasn't one thing. It was all of it. The angle of the hill, the way the cave dipped and twisted, turning the wind back on itself, the layer of snow above that sealed heat like a quilt, the way she built inward, always deeper, never up or out. She didn't trap heat, she cultivated it, nursed it like a sick child until it bloomed into something the cold couldn't touch. But they wouldn't understand that. They wanted secrets, tricks, a reason to believe this was luck or magic or some old Indian trick she'd stolen. They didn't want to believe a woman alone had done what they hadn't, so they laughed. At first, they joked about her stove, about the clay oozing down the walls like mud pies, about how the smoke pipe must lead to hell itself to keep them this warm. They laughed because it gave them back their pride, and she let them, until one of them, Charlie Madsen, tried to move the fire. He said it was too close to the wall, that he knew better places, that he'd once built a camp so clever it melted the ice under the snow. He started pulling logs with wet gloves. She grabbed his arm before he touched the hearth. You move that fire, she said, and the whole heat line breaks. He laughed in her face. You think I don't know how heat works? I've been setting traps in these hills since before your boys were born. She didn't argue. She just let go of his arm and pointed to the exit. He left. 12 hours later, they found him crouched under a tree 3 miles down the gulch, teeth locked together so hard they had to break them apart to feed him broth. He didn't talk after that, and no one questioned her again. The fire stayed where it was. They stayed too. But the cave, now crowded, warm, and alive with whispers, was changing. Not in the way a house changes with furniture, but in the way a heart changes when too many voices start speaking through it. There was laughter some nights, real laughter. There were songs. Once someone carved a little bird into the clay wall and named it Luck. But there were fights too, over food, over sleeping space, over whose turn it was to tend the fire. She kept the hatchet nearby, and she slept in shifts, because the more mouths that came, the more she felt the cave tightening, not physically but spiritually, like the earth itself was watching, wondering if she would protect what she'd made or let it be consumed. Then came the baby, a girl born 2 weeks early to a woman who had screamed so loud during labor it brought snow down from the hill roof. They thought she would die. They thought the child wouldn't cry, but the baby did cry, strong and clear. And that night, no one spoke of the cold. That was the first time she felt the cave forgive her, felt it grow warmer, felt the fire burn steadier. And as she sat by the clay stove with the newborn in her lap, the woman's head in her lap, and a dozen others sleeping in the shadows, she realized what she had built was not a shelter. It was a hearth, a beating thing, and it would not be given. It would be guarded. By the 7th night, there were 26 people in the cave. The snow had sealed the upper gulch entirely, making the road into town vanish like it had never existed. Sleds were useless now. Horses were either dead or missing, buried under drifts or eaten by the desperate, and the few who still came trudged through hip-deep powder, guided by the thin thread of smoke twisting from the cave's hidden vent like a last hope rising. They arrived exhausted, half frozen, often weeping. They didn't ask how she'd done it anymore. Now they just asked if there was room. The fire was kept alive around the clock, rotating hands, each pair briefed in silence on how much fuel to use, how far to bank the coals, how never to leave it unattended. The widow didn't need to speak the rules anymore. The cave spoke for her. Somehow it always knew when a stranger's step didn't belong. The wind changed. The walls grew damp. The heat pulled back like a shy animal. But the settlers kept coming. By the 8th night, They were building shelves into the cave wall, not for food, but for the dying. 3 had already passed. One from a fever that crept in after a broken finger went black, another from exhaustion, and one simply lay down by the back wall and never stood up again. The widow buried them herself. There was no earth to dig, no sun to mark graves. She wrapped their bodies in wool and snow and set them in the deepest pocket of the cave, near the old root crevice where steam still rose faintly. "They'll be warm there," she told the children. No one argued. Still, the pressure built. It wasn't the bodies, it was the living. It was the way they whispered when she passed now, the way they counted her footsteps, the way the men started glancing toward the fire when she bent over it, like they were measuring how easily it might be moved or taken or claimed. And it was the quiet rage in the eyes of the settlers who came last, the ones who had found the door barred, even for a moment, because by then she had started closing the door at night, not locking it, just pushing it tight, bracing it with stone. It was enough to make them feel shut out, and there is nothing more dangerous than a man who thinks warmth has been stolen from him. That was how it began, the talk. It started with mutters around the clay stove, grew into jokes, grew further still when the fire sputtered for the first time during a whiteout. "She's got a secret stash," someone said. "She's hoarding coal. She's hoarding food. She's digging deeper tunnels, keeping the best for herself." One man swore he saw her light a second fire at the back of the cave, that she had a room no one else knew about. Another claimed she had dry meat that hadn't been shared. And still another whispered that she must have made a pact, that no one lived this warm by luck alone. The whispers festered. She felt it in the way they accepted her food now, without eye contact, without thanks. Even the children stopped smiling at her. She kept the hatchet under her bedroll. Then one morning she found her stove broken. Someone had kicked out the side wall during the night, not enough to ruin it entirely, but enough to let the heat drain out, to force her to rebuild it before dawn if she wanted the cave to hold its warmth. She didn't say a word, just repaired it. The next night, someone poured snow in her fire pit. Again, she fixed it, quietly, without accusation. But they knew she knew, and that made them angry, because guilt has a smell. It rises off people like steam, and it doesn't fade in the cold. It freezes into them, makes them dangerous. She started watching for signs, movement near the stove, long silences after dark. She taught her boys to wake her in shifts. She slept with one ear open, always. And then the dog came back, not the dead one, a new one, lean, grey, half wolf, no collar, no owner. It appeared one night at the edge of the cave, silent as breath, and stared inside with eyes like tarnished silver. She thought it would run, but it didn't. It sat and waited, for what she didn't know. The others hated it. "Bad omen," one woman whispered. "Wolves only come close when death is near," said another. But the dog didn't blink, and it didn't leave. She fed it scraps, let it near the fire, gave it a place by the wall, away from the door. It never barked, never whimpered, just watched, like it was waiting for something to happen, and knew it would be soon. It was right. That night, while she slept, finally deeply, exhausted beyond her usual fears, she woke to voices. Too many, raised, arguing. The fire had gone low again, and they were blaming her. They stood around the stove like judges around a corpse, and she saw it in their faces before anyone spoke. The decision had already been made. "You've been hiding something," said the man from the second wave, the one with the cracked lantern and the daughter with frostbitten toes. "No one keeps heat this long, unless they've got something buried." "I've got a stove," she said. "You've got something under it." She stood slowly, adjusting her coat. Her boys stirred behind her, silent and afraid. The dog growled low, but didn't move. "There's nothing buried," she said. "Then let us dig." A few of the men stepped forward. She didn't flinch. "You dig through that stove, and this whole place falls cold. Then you better start explaining how you built it." She didn't speak. They grabbed shovels, and that was when the boy, Thomas, stepped forward. He didn't have his stick this time, just his bare hands, fists trembling. "You can't touch it," he said. "It's not just rocks. Mama made it herself. You break it and—" The man raised a hand, not to strike the boy, but to silence him. And that was when the cave answered. The wind howled, not outside, in, through the stone itself. A low, teeth-rattling moan, as if the hill had drawn breath. The fire pulsed, the shadows flickered. The dog stood and barked once, sharp, clear, commanding. And then the wall cracked. Not the stove, not the door, the wall, behind the back corner, where no one had gone. It split just slightly, and heat poured out. Real heat, not from fire, from the earth itself. Steam, warmth, a slow, hissing exhale of some ancient breath trapped for 1,000 years. The men fell silent. The widow stepped forward, eyes wide. She knelt, touched the stone. It was hot. She turned to the crowd. "This is why you lived." No one spoke. "This is why the children didn't freeze. Why the snow didn't claim us. Because this place was warm long before I got here. I just listened to it. Someone dropped their shovel. Another began to cry. But the man with the cracked lantern didn't move. He stared at her. You knew, he said. She nodded. And you didn't tell us. You weren't ready, she said. You thought heat was a gift. It's not. It's a covenant. With the earth, with loss, with silence. He turned and left. Didn't even take his coat. He walked into the snow. She didn't follow. The rest of them stayed, and the crack in the wall became a shrine. They called it the breath of the cave, and for the first time in weeks, no one argued, because they understood. It hadn't been her stove, or the mud, or the old chimney pipe. It had been her listening, her silence, her hands, her grief, and the earth had heard her. It was the sound of melting that woke them. No scream, no knock, no sharp crack of wood splitting or snow sliding, just that slow, steady drip of water falling rhythmically in the dark, one drop at a time, into a puddle, into the earth, into their dreams. And that meant one thing: the thaw had come. The widow sat up fast, heart pounding, already tasting mud in her mouth. Around her, bodies stirred. The smell in the cave had changed overnight. Less smoke, more rot. The clay walls, once bone dry, now glistened faintly with moisture. The woolen blankets that lined the shelves were damp at the corners. It wasn't spring yet, not truly, but it was coming, and that meant everything they'd built, every trick, every balance, every secret arrangement of smoke and breath and silence, was about to be tested, because cold had rules, but thaw had none. The snow above them, once a perfect insulator, would melt into weight. The frozen soil in the hillside would turn to sludge. The venting tunnel for the fire could collapse. The pantry hole could flood. The steam vent at the back, now considered sacred, might dry out or burst or shift. Everything was moving now. The cave, once their ally, might decide to reclaim its silence. And still, they had nowhere else to go. The town below hadn't thawed. Word filtered in, when it could, that the river had swelled. The bridge was gone. Several cabins had flooded and collapsed under the wet weight. A fever was running through the far end of the gulch. They had become the last warm place, a sanctuary, a lifeboat half buried in the mountain. But boats weren't built for land. She stood, wiping condensation off her face. The fire was low but steady. The breath of the cave, what they now called the gift, still pulsed from the crack in the back wall. But it was weaker, as if the mountain itself had shifted its attention elsewhere. She knew what that meant. The earth was waking, which meant the people inside had to start leaving. Not now, not all at once, but soon, one at a time, quietly. She began sorting her stores. There wasn't much left. A few strips of salted root, 3 clay jars of acorn flour still dry, 1 sack of beans that had gone soft. But she didn't count in meals anymore. She counted in days. Days she could keep the smallest alive. Days she could barter with heat. Days before the mountains stopped whispering and simply collapsed back into dirt. She called a meeting. No one wanted one, but they came. 24 people, seated or crouched or hunched against the walls like they were waiting for a verdict. They no longer challenged her, not after the crack, not after the fire had grown strong again, not after the child with frostbite on both feet began walking, and the woman with the fever finally breathed easy. They called her Ma, even though half of them were older than her, and yet she saw the fear in their faces now, because they knew what she would say. The thaw meant change, and change meant risk. She didn't speak loudly. She never had, but her voice carried. The heat won't last, she said. Not like this. The earth's moving. You can feel it in your bones. You can hear it in the way the water hits the floor. That warmth you feel. It's not a gift, it's a burden, and it's heavier every day, someone muttered. She continued. We built this for winter, but winter's changing, and if we don't, we'll drown in the thing that saved us. She looked around. I need 6 of you to leave by tomorrow. Silence. She waited. Then the preacher, thin now, hair white, voice weaker than it had been months ago, stood and nodded. I'll go, she nodded. Then a woman with her daughter, the one who had birthed the baby near the clay stove, stood too. 3 more, she said. No one moved. Then Charlie Madsen, the one who had once tried to move her fire, stood slowly, not looking at her. Me, he said. That left 2. She let the silence stretch, until finally the man with the cracked lantern rose, shame already carved deep into his shoulders. I'll go too. And that was the beginning, the first exodus. They packed quietly that night, just essentials. The widow gave them each a warm bundle, a few kindling sticks, a jar of packed ash and coals wrapped in leather so they could start a fire fast. She gave them her map, an old smeared drawing made by her husband years ago, showing trails, gulches, water sources. She crossed off anything she knew was buried or dead. When morning came, the cave door opened for the first time in 2 weeks, and they stepped into fog. Not snow, not ice, but fog, thick, steaming, the kind that clung to skin like breath. The thaw was real now. She watched them disappear, and as soon as they were gone, the cave changed again. The temperature dropped slightly. The steam stopped pulsing for a moment, then resumed, fainter. That night someone knocked. Not a settler, a stranger. He was younger than most, no beard, hands calloused not by chopping wood but by pulling reins. A rider then. He said little, just that he'd seen the smoke, just that he'd been sleeping under trees, just that the river had taken his horse and he had no home left. She let him in. The others did not like that. "Why now?" one woman asked. "Why take in a stranger when we just sent our own away?" "She took him because he knocked," said the preacher, "and because he didn't ask." The man said his name was Eli. He slept near the door, didn't speak much, didn't eat much, but he listened, and after 3 nights, he asked the widow a single question. "Why did you build it here?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "Because I saw the shape of the earth." "What shape?" "Like a cradle, like a place that could hold grief." He didn't ask more, but she saw him tracing the walls sometimes, pressing his ear to the stone, listening. He wasn't a settler, that much she knew. Something else had brought him, something that wasn't hunger or cold or desperation. He watched the others like a man taking inventory, and then he asked her another question. "Would you leave it behind?" She didn't answer, because she knew the truth. She couldn't, not just yet, not until it was safe, not until someone else knew how to keep it alive. She started teaching, not the settlers, not even her boys. She taught Eli how to bank the fire with ash, how to press clay with hot water and straw so it cured faster, how to vent steam without letting in cold, how to listen to the breath of the earth and tell when it was rising. He said little, but he learned. And then, one night she woke to shouting. The steam vent had burst, not from cold, from pressure. The thaw had accelerated. Water had seeped into the earth, turning packed snow into rivers. One of the outer walls had caved slightly, spilling clay and steam and half the food stores. She rallied the cave, not with orders, but with hands. She dug with them, hauled stone, rebuilt the clay. She sacrificed her own blanket to dam the leak. Her fingers bled, her boots filled with mud. By dawn, they had stopped the breach, but the cave was weaker, and that meant one thing: the last of them had to leave. By the time the final thaw came, there were only 6 people left in the cave: the widow, her 2 sons, Eli, the preacher, and the mother of the newborn, still nursing the child with a quiet steadiness that made her seem older than her 23 years. The rest had gone in waves, some with tears, some with anger, but most with silence, drifting off into the fog-bound valley below like seeds blown from a dying stalk. The cave, once filled with breath and noise, now felt like a hollowed lung, warm still, but waiting for its final exhale. And it would come soon, because the last of the snow above had started to slide. It came in the night, not with a roar but a sigh, a slow and dreadful shifting of weight. The widow felt it in her bones before she heard it, a pressure behind the ears like the mountain itself was warning her. The sound followed, wet, deep, groaning, a shearing of ice against stone. She leapt up and woke the boys before the noise had finished. They didn't speak. There was no need. Sam was already pulling on his boots. Thomas grabbed the clay pot with the smoldering coal inside. They knew what it meant when the snow sighed like that. They had lived too long beneath it not to understand. She turned toward the others. "Get ready to run," she said. Eli was already at the door. But it wasn't the door that gave way. It was the roof. Not the roof of the cave. The earth itself, further up the slope, where the thaw had hollowed the ridge until it finally collapsed inward, sending a cascade of melt and soil down the back face of the hill. The mouth of the old steam vent split wider, then cracked. Water poured through it. Not clean water, but thick, heavy slush filled with rock and clay, enough to drown a fire in seconds. They had minutes, maybe less. Eli grabbed the preacher, who had fallen trying to stand. The widow hauled the mother up with one arm and clutched the child with the other. Sam and Thomas followed without question. They didn't take the crates, not the food, not even the tools. Everything left behind was already claimed by the cave. It would be buried, or burned, or simply forgotten. But the fire had to come with them. Thomas held the clay pot like it was gold. The glowing coal inside had been burning since December. They ran through the narrow tunnel, the one Eli had quietly dug in the final week, a second exit, hidden beneath a brush of stone near the vent's curve. It wasn't finished, not really. It was rough, barely wider than a man's shoulders, crawling height in places. But it was the only way out. Water began to lap at their heels. The cave hissed as the breath of the earth met its own drowning. She didn't look back. They emerged into dawn, not sunlight, fog, but thinner now, the kind of fog that carries warmth in its belly, like a whisper of spring trying to remember itself. Behind them, the hill shuddered. Then came the sound, a muffled groan, a gasp, then silence. The cave was gone. The widow dropped to her knees, not from grief, from relief, because they had made it and they had brought the fire. The others gathered around her. Eli stood watch, eyes scanning the horizon like he expected the earth to open again. Sam placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. Thomas held the clay pot to his chest like a newborn. It was the preacher who spoke first. What now? She looked up. The hillside where the cave had been was still steaming, still weeping through cracks and seams. It looked like a grave. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the pot, removed the lid. The coal inside still glowed, faint, red, alive. She took a stick, lit it. A small flame flickered. Then she smiled. We build again. They walked south for 3 days. The thaw had turned the paths to sludge, but the air was warmer. The river had broken free of its ice, and though the bridge was gone, a fallen tree let them cross near the bend. They saw cabins washed to skeletons, livestock picked clean by crows, trees split from frost and wind and silence. But they also saw smoke, not just from their fire, from others, plumes in the distance, signs of life returning, the stubborn defiance of human heat against a wilderness that had tried to erase it. On the 4th night, they reached a hilltop above a bend in the valley. From there they saw the old Miller place, half collapsed but dry. The front porch had fallen, and the chimney was cracked, but the walls still stood, the roof still held. There were trees nearby, stone. A creek still half frozen but moving. The widow looked to Eli. He didn't ask. He just began to clear the porch. The boys gathered wood. The preacher made a circle of stones. She walked to the center of the broken house, set the glowing coal into the pit, fed it twigs, then pine, then a split log from the wreckage, and the fire took. It was small at first, but it didn't die. In the weeks that followed, others found them, not many. Just a few from the old cave, a mother and daughter, a boy with a broken sled, even Charlie Madsen, limping, carrying a sack of flour, and looking ashamed of everything he'd ever said. She didn't speak of the cave, no one did, but they built in the same shape, low, round walls with layered earth, clay-sealed roofs, venting pipes, root cellars dug deep, stoves pressed close to the floor, no tall chimneys, no proud porches, just warmth. And when someone asked where she had learned to build like that, she said nothing. She only looked toward the north, where the hillside still steamed in the early sun, where the earth still whispered, and where, beneath the thawed soil, the shape of her first home still waited. By summer, the valley was green again. The settlers returned to town. Some rebuilt, some moved on, but the widow stayed, and her home stayed warm, even on cold nights, even in early frosts, because she no longer built for comfort. She built for survival. And survival, she had learned, was not about being stronger than the cold. It was about knowing where the warmth lives and how to carry it with you, even into the deepest cave, even into silence, even into grief, and out again, alive.